The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of a weathered trading post, and Margaret Foster pressed her gloved hand against the window, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. She had traveled 3 weeks from Boston to reach this God-forsaken mountain territory in New Mexico. And now that she had finally arrived in Abiquiu in the summer of 1878, every instinct screamed at her to turn back. But there was no turning back, not when her father had already signed the papers, taken the money, and shipped her west like a piece of cargo to marry a man she had never met. The driver opened the door, and Margaret stepped down onto the dusty ground, her traveling dress already wilting in the dry heat. Abiquiu was hardly a town at all, just a scattering of adobe buildings clinging to the side of a red rock canyon, with mountains rising in every direction like silent witnesses to her fate. The air smelled of sage and pinon smoke, so different from the salt and industry of Boston that she felt like she had stepped onto another planet entirely. "Miss Foster." A weathered man with a silver beard approached, his hat in his hands. "I'm Tom Hendricks. Your intended asked me to fetch you and bring you up to his cabin. It's about a 2-hour ride up the mountain." Margaret swallowed hard, forcing herself to nod. "Thank you, Mr. Hendricks. I appreciate your kindness." The man's eyes softened with something that looked like pity, and Margaret hated it. She had seen that look too many times in the past month, ever since her father had announced that she would be marrying Zachary Carson, a mountain cowboy who ran cattle in the high country and needed a wife. Her father had lost everything in a bad business deal, and Zachary Carson had offered enough money to save the family from complete ruin. All it cost was Margaret's future. She climbed into the wagon, her trunk loaded behind her, and they began the journey up a narrow trail that switched back and forth across the mountainside. The higher they climbed, the more her stomach twisted with dread. What kind of man lived this far from civilization? What kind of man bought a wife like she was livestock? "Mr. Carson is a good man," Tom said suddenly, as if reading her thoughts. "Keeps to himself mostly, but he's fair and honest. You could do worse." Margaret wanted to laugh at that. She could also do better, but that option had been taken from her the moment her father had put pen to paper. She said nothing, just watched the landscape change from desert scrub to tall pines as they climbed higher into the Jemez Mountains. When they finally reached the cabin, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. The cabin itself was larger than she had expected, built of thick logs with a stone chimney and a wide porch that looked out over a meadow where cattle grazed. It was isolated and remote, but there was a certain rugged beauty to it that she had not anticipated. A man stepped out onto the porch, and Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Zachary Carson was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that fell past his collar, and a face that looked like it had been carved from the same stone as the mountains around them. He wore simple clothing, a work shirt and worn trousers, and his boots were scuffed with use. But it was his eyes that held her attention, dark and watchful, studying her with an intensity that made her want to shrink back into the wagon. Tom helped her down, and she stood there clutching her small traveling bag while her trunk was unloaded. Zachary walked down the porch steps slowly, his movements deliberate and careful, like he was approaching a spooked horse. "Miss Foster," he said, and his voice was deeper than she had expected, rough around the edges. "Welcome. I hope the journey was not too difficult." "It was long," Margaret said, surprised that her voice came out steady, "but I survived it." Something flickered in his eyes, might have been amusement or respect, she could not tell. "That's good. Survival is important up here." Tom cleared his throat. "I'll be heading back down before it gets dark. You need anything, Carson, you know where to find me." "Appreciate it, Tom." Zachary handed the older man some coins, and Tom tipped his hat to Margaret before climbing back onto the wagon and starting the journey back down the mountain. And then they were alone, standing in the golden light with the sound of the wind in the pines and the distant lowing of cattle. Margaret forced herself to meet Zachary's gaze, to not show the fear that was crawling up her spine. "I know this is not what you wanted," Zachary said quietly. "Your father explained the situation in his letters. I want you to know that I will not force anything on you. You will have your own room, your own space. I need help running this place, and I thought a wife would be better than hiring hands I cannot trust. But I will not touch you without your permission." Margaret blinked, completely thrown by his words. She had expected demands, expectations, perhaps even violence. She had not expected this quiet respect, this strange courtesy. "I do not understand," she said slowly. "You paid a considerable sum for this arrangement. Why would you not expect to receive what you paid for?" Zachary's jaw tightened. "Because you are not cattle, Miss Foster. You are a person, and you deserve to be treated as such. I may live like a hermit up here in these mountains, but I was raised with some decency." He picked up her trunk like it weighed nothing and carried it toward the cabin. Margaret followed, her mind spinning. This was not at all what she had prepared herself for during those long weeks of travel. She had steeled herself against cruelty, against being used and discarded. She had not prepared herself for kindness. The inside of the cabin was surprisingly well kept, with a large main room that served as kitchen and living area, a stone fireplace that dominated one wall, and two doors that presumably led to bedrooms. Everything was simple but clean, the furniture handmade but sturdy. There were books on a shelf near the fireplace which surprised her, and the windows were large enough to let in plenty of light. "This is your room," Zachary said, opening one of the doors. Inside was a bed with a thick quilt, a dresser, a small table with a wash basin, and another window that looked out over the meadow. "It is not fancy, but it is warm in winter and cool in summer. I will bring your trunk in." Margaret stepped into the room, touching the quilt with tentative fingers. It was beautiful work, the stitching precise and even. "Did you make this?" "My mother did before she passed. I have been saving it for when I had a wife." He set the trunk down at the foot of the bed. "I will give you time to settle in and wash up. Supper will be ready in about an hour. Nothing fancy, just stew and bread, but it will fill your belly." He left, closing the door gently behind him, and Margaret sank down onto the bed, her hands shaking. She had been so afraid, so terribly afraid, and now she did not know what to feel. Relief, certainly, but also confusion. Why had he done this? Why had he brought her all this way if he did not intend to claim the rights of a husband? She unpacked a few things, washed her face and hands in the basin, and changed into a simpler dress more suitable for the warm evening. When she emerged from her room, she found Zachary stirring a pot over the fire, the smell of cooking meat and vegetables filling the cabin. "Can I help?" she asked, feeling awkward and useless. He glanced at her, and she saw the way his eyes took in her appearance, quick and assessing before he looked back at the pot. "Can you slice bread?" "Yes." He gestured to a loaf on the counter and a knife beside it. Margaret picked up the knife and began cutting even slices, grateful to have something to do with her hands. They worked in silence for a few minutes, and she found herself stealing glances at him, trying to understand this man who had bought her but did not want to own her. "How long have you lived here?" she asked finally. 10 years. I came west after the war, wanted to get as far from people as I could, found this valley and knew it was where I needed to be. You fought in the war?" "Yes." His tone made it clear that was all he would say on the subject, and Margaret did not push. She had known men who came back from that war changed, haunted by things they would not speak of. They ate at a simple wooden table, the stew rich and hearty, the bread fresh and warm. Margaret realized she was famished, having eaten nothing but dried jerky and hardtack for the last leg of her journey. Zachary ate quietly, his manners better than she had expected for a man who lived alone in the mountains. "What do you need from me?" she asked when they had finished eating. "You said you needed help running this place." "What kind of help?" Zachary leaned back in his chair, considering her. "Cooking, mostly. Mending clothes. In the fall I will need help with preserving food for winter. I run about 100 head of cattle in the high meadows, and during calving season I am out for days at a time. It would be good to know there is someone here maintaining things, keeping the place running. In winter we get snowed in for weeks sometimes, and 2 sets of hands are better than 1 for keeping the paths clear and the animals fed." "I can do those things," Margaret said, feeling a bit more solid ground beneath her. This she understood, a practical arrangement, labor exchanged for security. "I am a good cook and a fair hand at sewing. I have never dealt with cattle, but I can learn. That is all I ask." He stood and began clearing the dishes. "You must be exhausted. You should rest. Tomorrow I will show you around the property, introduce you to the stock, explain how things work up here." Margaret helped him wash the dishes in a basin of heated water, their hands occasionally brushing in the soapy water. And each time she felt a strange jolt of awareness that she did not quite know what to do with. When everything was clean and put away, she bid him good night and retreated to her room, closing the door and leaning against it. Her first day as an arranged bride, and nothing had gone as she had feared. But that only made her more uncertain, because she had no idea what to expect next. She slept fitfully, waking often to the unfamiliar sounds of the mountains, the wind in the trees, the distant call of an owl, the creaking of the cabin settling. When dawn broke, she rose and dressed, braiding her hair and emerging to find Zachary already up, coffee brewing over a fire he had rebuilt in the stone hearth. "Morning," he said, handing her a cup. "Sleep all right?" "Well enough," Margaret said, which was not quite true but not quite a lie either. The coffee was strong and bitter, but it woke her up, and she was grateful for it. They ate a simple breakfast of eggs from the chickens she had not yet seen and more bread from yesterday's loaf. Then Zachary took her outside to begin showing her the property. The morning air was cool and crisp, scented with pine and earth, and the sky was so blue it almost hurt to look at. The chicken coop was behind the cabin, a sturdy structure with a dozen hens and 1 very proud rooster. There was a small barn where Zachary kept 2 horses, a milk cow and supplies. Beyond that were the pastures where the cattle grazed, red and white shapes against the green meadow grass, with the mountains rising beyond them in shades of blue and purple. "The stream runs year-round," Zachary said, pointing to where water sparkled in the sunlight. "We pull drinking water from the spring up there, but the stream is good for washing and watering the stock. In winter it freezes over, but we can break through the ice as needed." Margaret absorbed it all, trying to memorize the layout, the routine, the rhythm of this place. Zachary was a patient teacher, explaining things clearly and answering her questions without making her feel foolish for not knowing. As the morning wore on, she found herself relaxing slightly, the knot of fear in her chest loosening just a bit. They were walking back toward the cabin when they heard the sound of approaching horses. Zachary's entire demeanor changed, his hand going to the rifle he had brought with him, his body shifting between Margaret and the sound. "Get to the cabin," he said quietly, and there was steel in his voice now. "What is it? Just go, now." Margaret hurried toward the cabin, but she stopped on the porch, watching as 3 riders emerged from the tree line. They were rough-looking men, unshaven and dusty, with the hard eyes of people who had lived violent lives. Her heart began to hammer again, but for different reasons now. Zachary stood in the middle of the yard, his rifle held casually but ready, as the men rode up and stopped a respectful distance away. "Carson," the lead rider said, his smile showing missing teeth. "Heard you got yourself a woman, wanted to come pay our respects. You have seen her, Davies. Now you can leave." Zachary's voice was flat and cold. Davies laughed, but it was not a pleasant sound. "Not very neighborly of you, we just want to be friendly. Maybe share a drink, get to know the new missus." I said leave. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. Margaret gripped the porch railing, her knuckles white. The other two riders were spreading out slightly, and she realized with a cold rush of fear that they were positioning themselves for trouble. "Now, Carson, there is no need to be unfriendly," Davies said, his hand drifting toward his gun. "We are just trying to be welcoming." The shot was so sudden that Margaret jumped, a scream catching in her throat. But Zachary had not fired at the men. He had fired into the ground in front of Davies' horse, making the animal rear and dance backward, nearly throwing its rider. "The next one goes through you," Zachary said, and his voice was so cold it sent shivers down Margaret's spine. "You have 3 seconds to turn around and ride out of here." 1. Davies fought to control his horse, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "You are making a mistake, Carson." 2. The other two riders were already backing their horses away, clearly not eager to test Zachary's aim. Davies glared at him for another long moment, then spat in the dirt and yanked his horse around. "This is not over," he called back as they rode away. Zachary did not lower his rifle until they disappeared into the trees. Then he turned to look at Margaret, and she saw the concern in his eyes. "Are you all right? Who were those men?" Her voice shook despite her efforts to control it. "Trouble," Zachary said, walking toward the porch. "They run cattle in the valley below, but their herd seems to grow every year even though they never buy stock. I suspect they have been rustling from the smaller ranches around here. They do not like that I will not do business with them. Will they come back? Maybe." He climbed the steps and stopped in front of her. "I am sorry you had to see that, but I need you to understand something, Margaret. I will keep you safe here. That is a promise, but this is wild country and there are wild men in it. You need to learn how to shoot, how to defend yourself if I am not here." Margaret nodded slowly, trying to process this new reality. She had known the West was dangerous, but knowing it in abstract and seeing it face to face were two very different things. Over the following days, Zachary was true to his word. In addition to teaching her the rhythms of the ranch, he taught her how to handle a rifle, how to load and fire and clean it. Margaret had never held a gun before coming west, but she discovered she had a steady hand and a good eye. Zachary praised her progress without making her feel patronized, and she found herself wanting to earn more of his quiet approval. They fell into a routine. Mornings were for chores, tending the animals, gathering eggs, milking the cow. Margaret learned to bake bread in the cast-iron Dutch oven, to make stew from dried beef and root vegetables from the cellar, to mend tears in work shirts and darn holes in socks. Afternoons, Zachary often disappeared into the high pastures to check on the cattle, and Margaret used that time to explore the area near the cabin, always staying within sight of the buildings as Zachary had warned her to do. Evenings they ate together and sometimes sat on the porch as the sun set, watching the mountains turn purple and gold. They talked during these times, small conversations at first, but gradually growing deeper. Zachary told her about growing up in Missouri, about his parents who had died of fever, about his time in the war that he spoke of only in the vaguest terms. Margaret told him about Boston, about the society life that had seemed so important before her father's ruin, about the books she loved to read, and the dreams she had harbored of seeing the world beyond the narrow confines of drawing rooms and tea parties. "You are seeing the world now," Zachary said one evening, gesturing to the vast sweep of mountains and sky. "Maybe not the way you imagined, but the world nonetheless." "It is beautiful," Margaret admitted, and she was surprised to realize she meant it. "So different from everything I knew." Harder, but also more honest somehow. In Boston, everything was about appearances, about saying the right thing and being seen in the right places. Here, things just are what they are. "That is why I came here," Zachary said quietly. "After the war, I could not stand being around people pretending everything was fine, that we had not just torn the country apart. Up here, the mountains do not pretend to be anything but mountains. The weather does not pretend to be kind. It just is, and you deal with it or you do not." "Do you ever get lonely?" He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. "Yes," he finally said. "But lonely is better than being surrounded by people and still feeling alone. At least that is what I thought until recently." Margaret's heart skipped at that, but she did not know what to say, so she said nothing. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, more stars than she had ever seen in her life, a river of light spilling across the heavens. Weeks passed, and summer deepened into late August. Margaret's hands, once soft and pale, grew tanned and calloused. She learned the names of the mountains visible from the cabin, the patterns of weather that rolled through the high country, the habits of the cattle and horses. She learned which herbs grew wild in the meadow and could be used for cooking or medicine, taught by Zachary, who had learned from the Hispanic and native families who had lived in these mountains for generations. And she learned Zachary himself, the quiet man who had bought her freedom from one prison and offered her something she had not expected in another. She learned that he was unfailingly fair, patient with the animals and with her, slow to anger but immovable when his mind was made up. She learned that he read voraciously, that the books on his shelves were worn from use, and that he had a hunger for knowledge that matched her own. She learned that he had nightmares sometimes, that she could hear him moving around in the night, and that by morning he would be quiet and withdrawn until the memories faded back into whatever dark corner they lived in. And she learned that she was beginning to care for him, in ways that both frightened and thrilled her. It started small, noticing the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he was amused, the way his hands were gentle with the animals despite their strength, the way he always made sure she had the better portion at meals. It grew when he brought her wildflowers one day, an awkward gesture that made him flush when he handed them to her, saying only that he had thought she might like them for the table. It deepened the day she was thrown by one of the horses. She had been learning to ride, progressing well under Zachary's careful instruction, when something spooked her mount and it bolted. Margaret held on as long as she could, but when the horse jumped a fallen log, she went flying, hitting the ground hard enough to knock the wind from her lungs. The next thing she knew, Zachary was there, his face pale, his hands running over her arms and legs checking for broken bones. "Margaret, can you hear me? Margaret, talk to me." "I am all right," she gasped, trying to get air back into her lungs. "Just knock the wind out of me." But Zachary was not reassured. He lifted her carefully, carrying her back to the cabin despite her protests that she could walk. He set her down on her bed and went to fetch water and cloths, cleaning the scrapes on her hands and arms with a gentleness that made her want to cry. "I am fine," she said again when he sat back, his hands still shaking slightly. "Zachary, I promise I am fine. You could have been killed." His voice was rough, and when he looked at her, she saw something raw in his eyes. "When I saw you fall, I thought I had lost you, and I realized I could not bear it. I know I have no right to feel that way. I know you did not choose this, did not choose me, but Margaret, I have to tell you the truth. I am falling in love with you, and I do not know how to stop it." Margaret's breath caught for an entirely different reason now. She reached out and took his hand, holding it between both of hers. "What if I do not want you to stop?" Zachary went very still. "What?" "I did not choose this," Margaret said slowly, picking her words carefully. "You are right about that. I came here afraid and angry and feeling like my life had been taken from me. But these past weeks, living here with you, learning this life, I have come to realize something. I may not have chosen this at first, but I am choosing it now. I am choosing you, Zachary Carson, if you will have me truly, not just as help around the ranch, but as your wife in truth." For a long moment he just stared at her, as if he could not quite believe what he was hearing. Then slowly, carefully, he lifted his hand and touched her face, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. "I have wanted nothing more since the day you arrived," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I was afraid to hope for it. Afraid that you would always see me as the man who bought you, who took your choices away." "You gave me more choices than I had in Boston," Margaret said, leaning into his touch. "You gave me respect and patience and time. You gave me the chance to find myself in this wild place. And I have found that I am stronger than I thought, braver than I believed, and capable of loving a man I was supposed to fear." Zachary leaned forward and pressed his forehead to hers, his eyes closing. "Margaret Foster, you are the most remarkable woman I have ever known." "Then kiss me," she whispered. "Kiss me like you mean it." And he did, his lips finding hers in a kiss that was gentle at first but quickly deepened with all the longing and hope that had been building between them for weeks. Margaret kissed him back with equal fervor, her hands sliding up to tangle in his hair, pulling him closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Zachary rested his forehead against hers again. "I love you," he said. "I will spend the rest of my life trying to make you happy, trying to be worthy of this gift you have given me." "I love you too," Margaret said, and the words felt like freedom, like flying. "And you do not have to try to be worthy. You already are." They held each other as the afternoon light slanted through the window, and Margaret felt something she had not felt since her father had told her of the arrangement. She felt hope. That night, Margaret did not sleep in her room. She went to Zachary's, and they came together with a tenderness and passion that left them both breathless and whole. Afterward, lying in his arms with the sound of the wind in the pines outside, Margaret thought about how strange life was, how the things you feared most could sometimes turn into the greatest blessings. The next morning they woke tangled together, and Zachary kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips, like he was making up for all the weeks he had held himself back. They made breakfast together, stealing kisses between tasks, and Margaret felt like she was glowing from the inside out. "We should have a proper wedding," Zachary said as they ate. "I know we signed papers, but that was just legal business. I want to marry you proper in front of God and witnesses, so everyone knows you are my wife by choice, not just by contract." Margaret smiled, her heart swelling with love for this man who understood what she needed without her having to say it. "I would like that very much." They made plans to ride down to Abiquiu the following week, to speak to the priest and arrange a ceremony. But before they could make the journey, trouble found them again. It was 3 days later, just after dawn, when Margaret heard the cattle lowing in distress. She and Zachary both rushed outside to see several steers running through the meadow, separated from the main herd. And beyond them, near the tree line, she saw riders pushing more cattle toward the forest. "Rustlers," Zachary said, his voice hard. He ran for the barn, emerging with his rifle and his horse already saddling. "Margaret, stay in the cabin, bar the door. Do not open it for anyone but me." "Let me come with you," Margaret said, fear clutching at her chest. "You should not go alone." "I will not risk you. Please, Margaret, do as I say." He swung up onto his horse, and she saw the grim determination in his face. This was the soldier he had been, the man forged by war, and she knew she could not stop him. "Come back to me," she said, her voice breaking. "Zachary, please come back to me." "Always," he promised. And then he was riding hard toward the tree line where the rustlers were disappearing with his cattle. Margaret ran back into the cabin and barred the door as he had told her, then grabbed the rifle he had taught her to shoot and positioned herself by the window where she could see the yard. Her hands were shaking, her heart pounding so hard she felt sick, but she forced herself to stay calm, to remember everything Zachary had taught her. The minutes crawled by like hours. She heard distant gunfire, sharp cracks echoing across the mountains, and each shot made her flinch. She prayed harder than she had ever prayed in her life, begging God to bring Zachary back safely, promising anything if he would just come home. When she finally saw a horse approaching, she almost sobbed with relief. But as it got closer, she realized something was wrong. The horse was moving too slowly, and Zachary was slumped in the saddle, one hand pressed to his side. Margaret dropped the rifle and ran outside, reaching him just as he slid from the horse. She caught him, staggering under his weight but managing to keep him upright. "I have got you." "Zachary, stay with me. I have got you." She half carried, half dragged him into the cabin and got him onto his bed. His shirt was soaked with blood, and when she pulled it away, she saw the bullet wound in his side just above his hip. The sight of it made her stomach lurch, but she pushed the fear down. She could fall apart later. Right now, he needed her to be strong. She had watched her mother tend to sick and injured servants back in Boston, had learned the basics of wound care. She put that knowledge to use now, heating water, tearing clean cloth into bandages, cleaning the wound as best she could. The bullet had gone through, which was a blessing, but he was losing blood, and she did not know how much was too much. "Did you get them?" she asked as she worked, trying to keep him talking, keep him conscious. "Ran them off," Zachary said, his voice tight with pain. "Winged Davies. They will think twice before coming back." "You should not have gone alone," Margaret said, tears streaming down her face now that her hands were busy and she could not hold them back. "You stupid, brave, wonderful man. You should not have risked yourself like that." "Had to protect what is mine," Zachary said, and his hand found hers, squeezing weakly. "Had to protect you." "I am going to protect you now," Margaret said fiercely. "You are going to be fine. Do you hear me? You are going to be fine because I will not allow anything else." She got the bleeding stopped and the wound bandaged, then covered him with blankets because he was starting to shiver. She made him drink water, spooning it into his mouth when he was too weak to hold the cup himself. And then she sat beside him, holding his hand, and waited. The fever came that night, as she had feared it would. Zachary thrashed and mumbled, lost in memories of the war, calling out names she did not recognize. Margaret bathed his face with cool water, changed the bandages when they needed changing, and talked to him constantly, her voice a lifeline pulling him back from whatever dark places his mind was wandering. "You have to fight," she told him, her voice hoarse from talking. "You have to come back to me, Zachary. We are supposed to get married properly, remember? We are supposed to have a life together. You promised me always, and I am holding you to that promise. Do you hear me? You do not get to leave me now. I will not allow it." She did not know if he heard her, but she kept talking anyway, telling him about the future she wanted with him, the children she hoped they would have, the life they would build together in this wild mountain valley. She told him she loved him over and over, until the words blurred together and she was not sure if she was saying them out loud or just in her head. Dawn came and the fever broke. Zachary opened his eyes, clear for the first time in almost a day, and looked at her. "You are still here." "Of course I am still here," Margaret said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Where else would I be? You could have left, taken one of the horses and gone back to town. You would be safer there." "I am exactly where I need to be," Margaret said firmly. "Right here with you." "I meant what I said, Zachary. I choose this. I choose you. For better or worse, in sickness and health. I am not going anywhere." Zachary's eyes filled with tears, and he lifted his hand to touch her face. "I do not deserve you." "Well, you have me anyway," Margaret said, turning her head to kiss his palm. "So you will just have to accept it." He smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes, and Margaret felt like her heart might burst with relief and love. Zachary healed slowly over the following weeks. Margaret tended to him with fierce devotion, changing bandages, making him eat even when he had no appetite, helping him walk when he was strong enough to get out of bed. She also managed the ranch on her own, feeding the animals, gathering eggs, even riding out to check on the cattle that remained, the rifle always within reach. She discovered reserves of strength she had not known she possessed. She discovered that she was capable of far more than pouring tea and managing a household staff. She was capable of keeping a ranch running, of nursing a wounded man back to health, of facing her fears and not flinching. And Zachary, watching her, fell even more deeply in love. "You are amazing," he said one afternoon as she helped him walk around the cabin, building his strength back up. "I knew you were strong, but Margaret, you are incredible." "I am just doing what needs to be done," she said, but she was pleased by his praise. "No, you are doing far more than that. You are thriving here. This life suits you." Margaret considered that as they made another slow circuit of the room. He was right, she realized. This life did suit her. She loved the challenge of it, the satisfaction of working hard and seeing the results of that work. She loved the beauty of the mountains, the way the seasons changed with dramatic swiftness, the sense of space and possibility. And most of all, she loved the man beside her, the man who had given her the chance to discover who she truly was. By late September, Zachary was well enough to travel. They rode down to Abiquiu together, Margaret on the gentle mare and Zachary on his stallion, taking their time on the mountain trail. The aspens were beginning to turn gold, and the air had the crisp edge of autumn in it. In town, they spoke to the priest, an elderly man named Father Miguel, who agreed to marry them the following Sunday. They bought supplies, Zachary insisting on getting Margaret a new dress for the wedding, something finer than her work clothes. She chose a simple gown of deep blue that made her eyes look even brighter, and Zachary looked at her like she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Word spread quickly in the small community, and by Sunday, the little adobe church was packed with people. There were Hispanic families who had lived in the valley for generations, a few other ranchers and their wives, townspeople curious to see the mountain cowboy finally getting married. Even Tom Hendricks was there, beaming like a proud father. Margaret walked down the short aisle on Zachary's arm, since she had no one else to give her away, and it seemed right that they should approach this together, as equals. Zachary wore his best shirt and trousers, his hair neatly trimmed, and Margaret thought he looked impossibly handsome. Father Miguel performed the ceremony in a mixture of Spanish and English, blessing their union and binding them together in the eyes of God and the community. When Zachary slipped a simple gold band on her finger, Margaret felt like something clicked into place deep in her soul, a rightness she had never felt before. "I love you," Zachary whispered as they sealed their vows with a kiss, and Margaret kissed him back with all the love and hope in her heart. They celebrated with the community afterward, eating food that people had brought and accepting congratulations and well wishes. Margaret met the other ranch wives, women who welcomed her with open arms and promised to visit once the weather allowed. She felt the last pieces of her fear and uncertainty falling away, replaced by a sense of belonging that she had never had, even in Boston. As the sun began to set, Zachary and Margaret rode back up the mountain together, husband and wife in truth now, bound by choice and love and promises freely given. The cabin looked beautiful in the golden light, smoke curling from the chimney where they had left a fire banked, waiting for their return. That night they made love as married people, and it felt different, deeper, more complete. Afterward, lying in the darkness with Zachary's arms around her, Margaret thought about the journey that had brought her here, from fear and resignation to love and joy. It had not been an easy path, but it had been worth every difficult step. Winter came to the mountains with dramatic force. By early November, the first serious snowstorm buried the cabin under 3 feet of white, and Margaret understood what Zachary had meant about being snowed in. They could not go anywhere for days at a time, could barely keep the paths to the barn and chicken coop clear. But Margaret did not mind. She had everything she needed right here. They spent the long winter evenings reading together by the fire, Zachary teaching her about the cattle business and the mountains, Margaret reading aloud from the novels she loved. They cooked together, played cards, made love slowly and tenderly under piles of quilts while the wind howled outside. Zachary carved wooden animals for the children they hoped to have someday, and Margaret sewed baby clothes, their hands preparing for a future that felt bright with possibility. It was during one of these quiet winter nights that Margaret realized she had not had her monthly courses in some time. She counted back and felt a flutter of excitement and hope. When she told Zachary, he looked at her with such joy and wonder that she started to cry. "We are going to have a baby," he said, his hand resting on her still flat belly. "Margaret, we are going to be parents. Are you happy?" she asked, even though she could see the answer in his face. "I've never been happier in my entire life," Zachary said, pulling her close. "You have given me everything I did not know I needed. A home, a purpose, love, and now a family. I will spend the rest of my days thanking God for the gift of you." "We are the same age, you know," Margaret said, thinking of how far they had both come. At 23 and 24, they were young to have weathered so much, but that shared understanding of struggle and survival made them strong. "We are going to grow old together in this mountain valley, raising our children, building a life." "I cannot wait," Zachary said, kissing her softly. "I cannot wait to see what our life becomes." The baby was born in early summer, during a warm June morning when the meadow was full of wildflowers. A midwife from town had come up a week earlier to wait with them, and she helped Margaret through the long hours of labor with competent hands and soothing words. Zachary paced outside, unable to bear seeing Margaret in pain, until the midwife finally called him in to meet his son. The baby was perfect, with a shock of dark hair and his father's serious eyes. They named him James after Zachary's father, and Zachary held his son with tears streaming down his face, overcome with emotion. "Hello, little one," he whispered. "Welcome to the world. Your mother and I are going to love you so much. We are going to teach you to be strong and kind and brave. We are going to show you these mountains and these valleys, and tell you about how your mother came here afraid but found her courage. You are going to have such a good life." Margaret watched her husband with their son, and her heart felt so full she thought it might overflow. This was the life she had been afraid she would never have, the love she had thought was lost to her. But she had found it here in the wildest of places, with the most unexpected of men. As summer turned to fall and fall to winter again, their little family found its rhythm. James grew chubby and healthy, his laugh filling the cabin with joy. Zachary was a devoted father, patient and playful, teaching his son about the world with the same care he had taught Margaret. And Margaret thrived in her role as mother and wife, managing the household and the ranch with confidence born of experience. 2 years later, they welcomed a daughter, Elizabeth, who had her mother's blue eyes and sunny disposition. And 2 years after that, another son, William, who was quiet and thoughtful like his father. The cabin grew more crowded and more full of love with each addition, and Zachary built on 2 more rooms to accommodate their growing family. The ranch prospered too. With Margaret's help, Zachary expanded the herd and improved the bloodlines, selling cattle to the railroad towns that were springing up across the territory. They hired help during the busy seasons, young men looking for work and a chance to learn ranching. Zachary was a fair boss, and word spread that the Carson Ranch was a good place to work. Davies and his gang never bothered them again. Rumor said they had moved north into Colorado, chased out by the law that was slowly bringing order to the territory. The mountains felt safer, the community stronger, and Margaret was glad that her children would grow up in a world that was becoming more civilized while still retaining its wild beauty. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Zachary took Margaret up to a high meadow where they could see for miles in every direction, mountains rolling away to the horizon in shades of blue and green. Their children were home with a trusted neighbor woman, giving them rare time alone together. "Do you ever regret it?" Zachary asked, holding her hand as they looked out over the vast landscape. "Leaving Boston, coming here, marrying me." Margaret turned to look at her husband, this man who had become her whole world. He was older now, lines around his eyes from squinting into the sun, his hair touched with gray at the temples. But he was still the same man who had promised to wait for her heart, who had given her time and space to choose him freely. "Never," she said firmly. "Not for a single moment. This life, this place, you and our children, this is everything I was meant to have. I just had to travel 3,000 miles and face my fears to find it." "I am the lucky one," Zachary said, pulling her close. "I was just existing before you came, going through the motions. You taught me how to live again, how to hope and dream and love. You gave me a reason to be more than a hermit hiding in the mountains." "We saved each other," Margaret said, resting her head on his shoulder. "That is what love does. It saves us from the prisons we build for ourselves, and shows us what is possible when we are brave enough to trust." They stood there as the sun set, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. 2 people who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances and built something beautiful from fear and uncertainty. Below them, in the valley, was their cabin full of children and life. Behind them were the mountains that had witnessed their journey from strangers to soulmates. And ahead of them stretched years of love and partnership, challenges and joys, a life fully lived in the wild heart of the West. As stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Zachary and Margaret walked hand in hand back down the mountain trail toward home. And if anyone had asked Margaret in that moment if she would change anything about the path that brought her here, she would have said no without hesitation. Because every difficult step, every moment of fear and doubt, had been necessary to bring her to this perfect place, to this perfect love, to this perfect life that she had built with her mountain cowboy in the high country of New Mexico. Years continued to pass in the rhythm of seasons. The children grew, learning to ride and rope and raid, to appreciate both the practical knowledge needed for ranch life and the beauty of books and learning that their parents valued. James grew tall and serious, taking after his father in temperament and his mother in his love of reading. Elizabeth was bright and fearless, riding out with her father from a young age and showing a natural gift for handling horses. William was the dreamer, spending hours sketching the mountains and wildlife, showing an artistic talent that neither parent quite understood but both encouraged. The ranch continued to expand, and Zachary's reputation as a fair dealer and skilled cattleman spread throughout the territory. But he never lost his love for the high country, for the solitude and beauty that had drawn him here in the first place. And Margaret, who had once known only the constraints of Boston society, became known throughout the region as a woman of strength and wisdom, someone others came to for advice and help. They hosted barn dances and celebrations, opening their home to the community that had welcomed them. They weathered droughts and hard winters, celebrated good years, and supported neighbors through bad ones. They watched New Mexico change around them, becoming more settled, more civilized, though the mountains themselves remained eternal and wild. On quiet evenings, when the children were asleep, and they sat together on the porch watching the stars, Zachary and Margaret would sometimes talk about those early days, the fear and uncertainty that had marked their beginning. "I almost ran away, you know," Margaret confessed one night when they had been married for 15 years. "That first night, I lay in bed planning how I would steal a horse and ride back to town, find some way to get back to Boston." "What stopped you?" Zachary asked, his arm around her shoulders. "Curiosity, I think. You were not what I expected, and I wanted to understand why. I wanted to know why a man who bought a bride would treat her with such respect. And then, before I knew it, I was not staying out of curiosity anymore. I was staying because I wanted to be here with you." "I knew I loved you after 2 weeks," Zachary admitted. "The way you faced everything with determination, the way you were not afraid to learn, to try new things, to become someone different than who you had been. I watched you transform from a frightened girl into a strong woman, and I fell more in love with you every single day." "We have built a good life," Margaret said, leaning into him. "Better than I ever imagined possible." "The best life," Zachary agreed, kissing the top of her head. When James was 18, he announced his intention to study law in Santa Fe, wanting to help bring justice and order to the territory that was rapidly moving toward statehood. Margaret and Zachary were proud, even though they would miss him terribly. They gave him their blessing and the money they had saved for his education, watching him ride away with a mixture of sadness and joy. Elizabeth, at 16, showed no interest in leaving the ranch. She had inherited her father's love for the land and cattle, and she told her parents firmly that she intended to stay and help run the ranch. She had no interest in being shipped off to some finishing school to learn how to be a proper lady. "I am already a proper lady," she declared. "I just happen to be one who can rope a steer and break a horse. The ranch will need someone to run it someday, and I intend to be that person." Margaret looked at her daughter, so fierce and certain, and saw herself in those determined eyes. "Your father and I support whatever you choose to do with your life," she said. "If running the ranch is your dream, then we will teach you everything we know." And they did, Zachary taking Elizabeth under his wing and showing her not just the physical work of ranching but the business side, teaching her to read markets and negotiate deals. Margaret taught her daughter the household management and record keeping, the skills that were just as important as roping and riding. Elizabeth absorbed it all with eager intelligence, and both parents knew the ranch would be in good hands when the time came. William, at 14, was still finding his path. He loved the ranch but was drawn to art and beauty in ways his siblings were not. Zachary encouraged this, remembering how his own parents had supported his interests even when they did not fully understand them. He arranged for a traveling artist to give William lessons, and they all watched with amazement as the boy's talent blossomed. More years passed. Margaret's hair gained threads of silver, and Zachary's hands grew gnarled from decades of hard work. But they were still strong, still in love, still partners in every sense of the word. They celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary surrounded by family and friends. James home from his law practice with a wife of his own. Elizabeth managing the daily operations of the ranch with competent authority. William preparing to travel east to study art at a real academy. 25 years, Margaret marveled as they danced together at the party. It seems impossible that it has been so long, and yet I can barely remember life before you. I cannot remember life before you at all, Zachary said, holding her close. You are woven into every memory, every moment. You made me whole, Margaret. You took a broken man hiding in the mountains and taught him how to live again. You gave me freedom, Margaret replied. Real freedom, not the illusion of it I had in Boston. You gave me the space to become who I was meant to be, and then you loved that person with your whole heart. That is the greatest gift anyone has ever given me. They kissed while their family and friends cheered, and Margaret thought about the girl who had arrived at this mountain ranch 25 years ago, terrified and angry and certain her life was over. That girl could never have imagined this, could never have dreamed that fear and uncertainty would transform into a love story for the ages, a partnership that weathered every storm and emerged stronger. As they grew older, Zachary and Margaret gradually handed over more of the ranch operations to Elizabeth, who had married a good man from a neighboring ranch and brought him into the family business. But they still lived in the cabin, now expanded into a proper ranch house, but still centered around that original structure where they had begun their life together. They became grandparents, delighting in James's children who visited during summers, in Elizabeth's babies who were born right there on the ranch. They watched the territory become the state of New Mexico in 1912, celebrating the milestone with their community. They saw the modern world slowly encroaching on their mountain valley, automobiles replacing horses on some roads, electricity reaching even remote ranches, but they held on to the rhythms and values that had sustained them for decades. On their 50th wedding anniversary, surrounded by children and grandchildren, Zachary stood and raised his glass. 50 years ago, I made the best decision of my life. I sent for a bride, not knowing what to expect, hoping only for help and maybe companionship. What I got was so much more. I got a partner, a friend, a lover, a mother for my children and the great love of my life. Margaret, you are my everything. You always have been and you always will be. Margaret was crying openly now, as were most of the people gathered around them. You waited for my heart, she said, her voice shaking with emotion. You could have demanded obedience or submission, but instead, you gave me time and space to choose. You taught me that love is not about ownership or control. It is about freedom and trust and partnership. You are the best man I have ever known, Zachary Carson, and I thank God every single day that he brought me to this mountain valley and to you. They kissed to thunderous applause. Two people who had somehow managed to build a love story that spanned half a century, that had weathered every challenge and emerged triumphant. As the celebration continued around them, Zachary led Margaret out onto the porch, to the same spot where they had sat so many evenings watching the sun set over the mountains. The view had not changed, the peaks still rising in magnificent splendor, the valley still green and beautiful below them. Do you remember that day I took you to the high meadow? Zachary asked. Our 10th anniversary. Of course I remember. You asked if I regretted coming here. I never asked you again. Do you regret it, I mean? Margaret turned to look at her husband, this man who was as much a part of her as her own heartbeat, who had been her companion and partner for 50 incredible years. His hair was white now, his face deeply lined, but his eyes were still the same, still looking at her with all the love and devotion he had shown from the beginning. "Every moment with you has been a gift," she said firmly. "Every single one. The hard times taught us we could survive anything together. The good times taught us to appreciate joy when it comes. And the everyday moments in between taught us that love is not just about grand gestures or dramatic declarations. It is about showing up, day after day, choosing each other over and over again. So no, I do not regret a single moment. This life with you is the greatest adventure I could have asked for." Zachary pulled her close, and they stood there as the sun painted the mountains in shades of gold and rose. Two souls who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful from fear and hope. Behind them, through the windows, they could hear their family laughing and talking, the sound of life continuing, of legacy being built. And ahead of them, for however many days they had left, stretched more time together, more moments of quiet partnership and deep love, more sunsets watched from this porch, more nights spent in each other's arms. It was everything Margaret had never known to dream of when she had stepped off that stage coach so many years ago. And it was more than Zachary had ever hoped for when he had decided to send for a bride from back east. They had both been looking for something when they found each other. Margaret had been looking for escape, for survival, for any option besides the one her father had thrust upon her. Zachary had been looking for help, for companionship, for something to fill the hollow places the war had carved in his soul. What they found instead was a love that transformed them both, that made them better and stronger and more whole than they had ever been alone. As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Zachary and Margaret went back inside to rejoin their family, their hands intertwined as they always were, as they always would be. And if anyone had asked them the secret to 50 years of marriage, they would have said it was simple, really. It was about waiting for a heart to open rather than demanding entry. It was about giving someone the freedom to choose, and then honoring that choice every day. It was about partnership and respect and friendship as much as passion and romance. It was about an arranged bride who arrived at a mountain cabin afraid, and a cowboy who waited patiently for her heart, and the beautiful life they built together in the wild country of New Mexico. A life that proved that sometimes the most unexpected beginnings lead to the most extraordinary endings. Their story became legend in the valley, passed down through generations as an example of what love could be when people were brave enough to choose it, patient enough to nurture it, and committed enough to protect it through whatever storms might come. And long after they were gone, their descendants would walk the same mountain trails and sit on the same porch and look out at the same magnificent mountains, carrying forward the legacy of two people who loved each other completely and built something that would endure long after they were just memories. The ranch continued for generations, Elizabeth's children and grandchildren keeping it running, preserving both the land and the story of how it all began. The original cabin was maintained as a historical site, a reminder of those early days when a frightened young woman from Boston and a reclusive mountain cowboy found each other and changed both their lives forever. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind whispered through the pines and the last light painted the mountains gold, people swore they could still feel the presence of that love, as eternal and enduring as the mountains themselves, a testament to what is possible when fear is met with patience, when uncertainty is answered with kindness, and when two hearts are given the freedom to find each other in their own time. Margaret Foster Carson and Zachary Daniel Carson lived into their 80s, an impressive feat for their time, passing within months of each other as if even death could not long separate them. They left behind a legacy of love and family, of hard work and integrity, of lives well lived in a place they had made their own through commitment and care. Their story was one of the Old West, but also timeless, a reminder that love can be found in the most unexpected places and circumstances, that courage comes in many forms, and that sometimes the things we fear most become our greatest blessings. It was a story of an arranged bride who reached a mountain cabin afraid, and a cowboy who had the wisdom and patience to wait for her heart, and the beautiful life they built together when fear gave way to trust, and trust blossomed into a love that lasted a lifetime and beyond.